Alright, we're done. Motor traverses upward and hits the limit switch and stops. I'm going to have to go ahead and adjust that range of motion so that I can go ahead and put the lock into position on the motor rest, but other than that we're good to go. So I'm going to put this at the beginning of the video. I learned a lot in doing this, and so I've got some tips for you that I'm going to add, that I'm going to put in now that are probably going to contradict what you're going to see in a minute or two. Just know that I found a little bit better way as I was moving along. So let's talk about the tools that you're going to need in order to get this done. So I found that I needed an 8mm nut driver in order to remove the screws for the cowling cover. You'll need a 10mm, like a box end wrench, or a small little micro ratchet. You'll need that 10mm wrench in order to remove the mounting plate that holds the limit switch in place. You need a 12mm socket on a ratchet so that you can remove the front cover of the engine itself. There's a lower front cover that holds the locking mechanism for the housing. That's got to come off. I also found it easier to use locking forceps. There's a couple of zip ties that you have to install in order to provide strain relief and to hold the cables in place for the limit switch and for some of the cabling inside the housing, and just replace the zip ties. So you'll also need some micro zip ties, something that's maybe about 1/8 of an inch wide, because the mounting holes are actually pretty small. And then I used also some diagonal cutters, and the diagonal cutters were simply used to snip off the zip ties on the way out. The switch itself that I replaced, I bought this online, and it looks to be in pretty bad shape. I guess it's no wonder that it was becoming intermittent. The normal condition for this switch is in the closed position, so it actually conducts when the trim is capable of moving upward. The switch is in the closed position, and then when the engine tilts up, it hits this little switch activator. The switch breaks continuity, and the engine can no longer tip up. So this switch is part number 37722-93J11. And I think that's about it for the parts. So let's talk a little bit about how this whole thing went together before I actually show you what I did. So the very first thing, of course, is you pull the engine cover off, and there's a gasket underneath here, right along the bottom. Pull that off. Then pull both sides of the cowling off, both the port side and the starboard side. It just makes it much easier to get to things. Once you get that taken care of, then you remove in the very front of the engine, using the 12mm bolts that you'll see, you remove that cover plate, and that pulls out. Once that cover plate pulls out, you can access the 10mm bolts that hold the switch into position. And those 10mm bolts hold a bracket that pinch the switch. One thing I'd like to mention is that when you do the reassembly, make sure that the switch is inserted correctly into the cover, the bracket. When I was reinstalling it, it actually wanted to pop out just a little bit, and so it would be a problem if it was popped out and you went ahead and cranked down on it. You torque it down, you're liable to break either the switch or the mounting plate. So make sure that that thing is registered correctly. The wire routing, in order to get the wire from the switch up inside the housing, you need to pay attention to how it routes underneath the bracket that holds the front cover plate on. Okay? There's also a notch cut in the cover plate, on the front cover plate, that will accept the opening. I was going to try to leave the second gasket on. There's another gasket that runs down here, down at the bottom of the engine. I don't know what to call it other than the upper gasket for the mid unit. It turns out that it's easiest to simply remove that gasket. There's a plastic pin on the starboard side that you can just pull out, and you can unwrap the gasket, and it allows you to have really good, easy access to the way the wires come in and out. There's also another zip tie that zip ties the cable assembly together as another strain relief point. So just get a few zip ties and have them ready to go. All in all, it was a pretty simple process. For me, maybe not so much, and I hope that maybe my fumbling around out here will save you some time. I think if I had to do this again, I could easily do it in an hour, maybe even 45 minutes. So I did it myself because I don't have access to a marine mechanic within a couple of hours, and I simply have to do this myself if I want to get it done in a timely fashion and without using up a ton of money. So I just want to close by saying that, you know, if I can do this, you can do this. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. Good luck. So I recently had some intermittent problems with my boat motor. I've got a 2002 Suzuki 115 DF motor, and I found that I was having intermittent problems with my trim. Go to the lake. I went to the lake one day, and I went and I dropped the motor down. Then I thought, oh, I'm going to drop it. I'm going to bring it back up, right? So I went to bring it back up, and there was absolutely no response to the trim up, which kind of had me panicked because I was about 150 miles away from home, and I didn't like the idea of driving home with my boat motor in the down position. So after kind of letting it sit just for a couple of minutes, I fiddled with the trim switch, and all of a sudden it started working again. So that wasn't the first time that it had happened. It had actually happened here at my house as well. And I thought, what could be going on? I did some web searching, and it turns out that there's a lot of problems associated with the trim limit switch for the up trim on these boat motors. So what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try to swap out this trim limit switch, and I thought that I'd go ahead and document the process because I wasn't able to find anything on these newer Suzukis that showed how to do it. So follow along with me, don't make my mistakes, and let's see if we can get through this together. Okay, apologies in advance if this is out of focus. I think you could probably see what's going on here. I'm looking at the front of the engine, and on the front of the engine, on the actual kind of, I don't know what to call it, maybe the hinge pin for the entire engine, this is what supports it as it swivels up and down. There's a little cam switch, or a little cam activator, this little black piece of plastic that you can move up or down, and that actually controls the stop point limit for your motor when you bring it into the trim up. Now hidden underneath this protective plate, you see this little silver switch right here, and that's the actual stop switch itself. So the motor hinges upward, and that switch comes in contact with the cam, and it opens the circuit. That's a normally closed switch. In order to get to that, we're going to have to remove a couple of these bolts, and then we've got to figure out how to route the wiring into the engine cover itself, actually into the through the cowling. So I think what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and take the top cover off. We're going to take the side cowling covers off and see if we can't figure out how to get to the wiring. And I've got a couple of ratchet wrenches that will try to take that protective plate and replace this switch. So I guess that's what's next. So I'd like to point out that you might not have to actually take both sides of the cowling cover off. I think you could probably leave the starboard side on and just take off the port side. They share kind of common screws though, so since I've never done this before, I'm going to go ahead and back the first 4 screws out that you might find. They're actually kind of in the narrow portion of the cowling itself. There's some that attach cowling to cowling and some that attach cowling to frame. So I'm going to try to just take out the 4 on the starboard side cowling that attach to the other cowling and see if I can pull off just the port side. Now, if you bought this motor new, you would have gotten a fancy little wrench that had a 8mm socket on the end of it that you would use to access these screws and to pull the screws out. It also has the ability to insert like a number 2 Phillips head, but what I found is that these screws have a tendency to get a little bit corroded, and if you try to back them off with a screwdriver, you're almost certainly going to screw up the number 2 screw itself. So if you don't have the tool that takes the cowling covers off, just go to Harbor Freight, buy the little kit for $4 or whatever it is, use the 8mm, and then I'm going to use a extension that I likewise got at Harbor Freight that allows me to just go ahead and interface it to a nut driver. So I'm going to use this to go ahead and remove these screws, and we'll see if we can't get the cowling cover off on just the port side. Okay, the screws that you need to remove in order to remove just the port side cover are 5 screws on the starboard side. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These other 2 that are up in here attach the starboard side cowling to the engine frame, and you don't need to remove them. On the other side, there are 2 additional screws that need to be removed. One's underneath here, kind of hidden by this cable clamp assembly, and then one at the very front of the engine that secures the cowling to the frame itself. So you notice I've also detached the cable clamp here in preparation for removing the cowling side. Okay, I'm ready to take the cowling cover off, and I found a couple of small problems that I think I'll show you how to work around, at least what I did. So I have the gasket off, by the way, the cowling to the head cover gasket here, And I've removed the cable clamp. The issue that I'm having is that the only thing that's currently holding the cowling on is this wiring harness that goes to the electrical system and to the trim switch here on the side of the engine. Now, I tried to disconnect this switch, this connector itself, but it appears that there are actually 3 locking pins on this, so it's not like you simply squeeze it and pop it apart. You have to press 3 little tabs on it in order to get it to come apart. I actually struggled with it for a few minutes. I tried to push the tabs in with a pin and get them to hold in place as I wiggled it around, and I decided that it'd be just far easier to just go ahead and push the actual trim limit switch off of the cover and let it dangle while I work on the side of the motor. Okay, Murphy has struck a little bit. So in order to access the wiring point, the penetration point between the switch and the inside of the engine, we are going to have to remove this front panel cover. And in order to remove this front panel cover, we're going to have to take out these 2 12mm bolts that are right here. And we have this upper screw that holds the starboard cowling to the front panel. So we're going to go ahead and see if we can't get this off of there so we can access the switch wiring. So I gave up. I made a heroic effort to try to keep both sides of the lower unit cowl on, and it simply was going to be much easier to take them both off, given that there was just 2 more screws that held it on the starboard side. It came right off. Once I took that off, I was able to remove the front access cover using the 2 12mm bolts, so those are gone. The connector that holds the limit switch is this green connector here on the front. There's only 1 locking mechanism, so it makes it really easy to come apart. You'll probably need a small screwdriver unless your manual dexterity is better than mine, which there's a good chance that it is. So that's apart. And then the wiring harness that actually holds, that pinches this up against the engine base itself here, I don't know what to call it, the frame of the engine, is the gasket that goes around the lower unit. It's kind of the lower mid-unit gasket, maybe, I don't know what to call it. And you know, it's held in place by 2 little plastic pins over here on the starboard side, but I think there's enough stretch in here that I'm going to be able to remove this without pulling that gasket off. So I'm gonna give that a try. And I guess that's what's next. So there's also, I might as well mention this now. So the screws that actually hold the limit switch in place are a couple of 10mm screws, bolts, and they're on this plate right here. So we're going to use this little wrench to take this plate off and then see if we can determine how that's held in place. It looks like I might have to run the steering actuator over so that I can get to access to, I assume that there's probably some Phillips screws or something that hold the switch down, but we'll find out in a minute. So we pulled out the 2 10mm bolts that held the switch cover in place, and this is the switch cover right here. And it turns out that the switch is not held to the frame by any screws. There's simply a couple of pins on the bottom of the cover plate that register with the holes in the switch and hold it in place. So I'm looking at this switch right now, and this whole area is just, you know, overall pretty nasty. It's 7 years old, and I would bet it's never been cleaned. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clean this up, and I'm going to try to install the new switch and route that wiring around. And I won't bore you with the video, but with a little luck, I'll be back in a minute. Let me break in here just for a second while I'm working on this. You might notice that there is a tiny little zip tie that performs some sort of stress relief for this cable that holds the power tilt limit switch up against this frame right here. And so I've got a small zip tie that I'm going to try to replace this with as well. But in order to remove this, you need something like diagonal cutters or whatever, right? You'll also notice that as I've been working on this, I'm turning the engine back and forth, left or right, depending on what I need to do in order to get to the various holes or perhaps in this instance, the zip tie. So be prepared to be moving your engine right and left using the steering wheel, of course. And I'll get back at it. I'll be back in a minute. Oh, so as a side note, you know what's a lot of fun is to misplace a critical component when you're trying to work on an engine and you're trying to get things buttoned up before the windstorm comes. So yeah, feel free to order a part place it somewhere in your house that only you know, forget where it's at, and then spend 20 minutes frantically looking for this part. If you need to know the switch part number for this, the switch part number is 37722-93J11. So that's the part, and I'm going to go ahead and start assembling it now. Do you remember when I said Suzuki engineers didn't hate you? I think I want to retract that statement. So in order to get that zip tie into the location to provide strain relief for the trim limit switch cable, you've got to raise the engine up a little bit. So what I did was I mounted the trim limit switch into the bracket, placed it back into position on the frame of the motor, and then that allowed me, because I was able to connect the switch, I was able to raise the motor up so I can get inside this thing. So really, there's a couple of ways you could do this, and I'm probably making too big of a deal out of this. But long nose pliers would be handy. I ended up just using some forceps from my fishing set so that I could grab the end of the zip tie and poke it up through the hole, but it was a little bit of a pain, but I thought I'd just share that with you. In addition to that, there's another zip tie on the cable assembly near the point where it enters under the rubber gasket. I did remove the rubber gasket, this mid-unit gasket. It turned out to just remove easily, and it opened up all the wiring to be able to replace the harness without, or the connector without having to pry or poke or risk tearing anything. So I think I'm ready to go ahead and zip tie this in place, put it back together, and just do the overall reassembly, and we'll see how it goes from there. Talk to you in a minute. Okay, here's a bonus tip for you. Remember that before you put the front cover plate on the engine, that all of these wires should stay well over here on the port side. So here's the penetration where we have that little gasket that allows us to bring the wires up into the engine housing, and all these wires need to stay over here, or I shouldn't say all of them, at least these two need to stay over here to the port side. Additionally, as you're massaging this gasket back into place, keep in mind that you've got the, I think this is the water speed pickup tube, that also has to pass in between this gasket. So, I found that by maneuvering the engine back and forth, it, you kind of wiggle it back and forth, and then you just massage that gasket in there. And it looks like we're hopefully good to go to place the cover plate on now. Okay, do you remember when I said that when we were running this wiring, we wanted to stay well to the port side and kind of underneath this engine support brace? Well, this is why. Because the access point for these wires runs through this area here, and there's actually a cutout in this front plate that has an opening that allows those wires to penetrate through. So when you're placing this front cover plate on, just remember that you have to clear these wires, and then you also have to clear the speedometer tube on the other side, and those cutouts are going to line up with the wires or the speedometer tube on either side. So just keep an eye on that, and you should be fine. Now, one other thing, what I did was I routed the power tilt switch limit switch connector up here, kind of more towards the front of the engine. And so my plan is what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to keep the old wiring harness, and I'm going to cut off this portion of this wiring harness, cut it off right here, splice those two wires together, so that if some point in the future, if I'm at a boat dock or whatever and I can't run this thing up and down, I'm going to get into the engine cowl, unplug that switch, that connector, and plug in this short-circuited connector, and it'll allow me to then raise the engine. So I'm going to keep this around. So I think we're getting closer. Time to put the side cowlings on and I guess button this thing up. Well, so it's hard to believe, but got the switch replaced. All the parts are in place. Motor trim seems to be working. I think it's just a matter of putting the cowling covers back on and the engine cover, and I think we're going to be done. This has gone actually pretty well. I have hardly any parts left over, so I'm going to call this a success.